My daughter-in-law tried to steal my $1,900, have me declared mentally incompetent, and lock me away in a luxury prison, all while calling it family love. She thought a 68-year-old woman would be easy prey. She was dead wrong. This story will show you the exact warning signs of elder financial abuse and how I turned the tables on a predator who'd been doing this for years. If you're dealing with manipulative family members or protecting elderly parents, you need to hear this. Buckle up, because this goes from the most humiliating day of my life to the most satisfying revenge. And it ends with handcuffs and an 18-month prison sentence. Sometimes the prey becomes the predator. Victoria stood in my Beverly Hills living room, her smile as cold as December frost, while the notary shuffled papers like he was dealing cards for my funeral. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the mansion I'd helped them buy, casting long shadows across the Italian marble floors that suddenly felt like the walls of my own tomb. I smiled back at her with the same practiced grace I'd perfected through 42 years of motherhood and said, "Perfect timing, Victoria, but let's make a quick stop at the Beverly Hills police station first. They've been waiting to hear about those documents I sent them yesterday." The color drained from her face faster than water down a broken drain, and in that moment, I saw exactly what she was underneath, all that practiced elegance and designer perfection. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. You're probably wondering how I got here. Standing face to face with the daughter-in-law who thought she'd outsmarted a 68-year-old woman who'd built her own fortune from nothing. Well, buckle up, because this story starts with the most humiliating 24 hours of my life and ends with the most satisfying. 2 days earlier, I'd watched my only son, Jackson, marry Victoria at St. Matthew's Episcopal Cathedral, the same church where I'd married his father 35 years ago when we had nothing but dreams and determination. The ceremony was breathtaking, with white orchids flown in from Hawaii and a string quartet that had performed at the Kennedy Center. Victoria looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could finally build a real relationship after 5 years of careful politeness and subtle power struggles. The reception was at the Hillcrest Country Club, the same establishment where I'd once worked as a server to put Jackson through Stanford Business School. The irony wasn't lost on me. Standing in the same ballroom where I'd once cleared tables, now as the mother of the groom, watching my $19,500 disappear into their dream wedding like smoke in the California wind. I'd scraped together that money from my investment portfolio, money I'd saved from decades of building my interior design business from scratch, walking away from luxurious client dinners to save every penny for my son's future. Victoria had insisted on the most expensive everything, the imported flowers, the celebrity chef, the champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. "Eleanor's been such a help," Victoria announced to a table full of her sorority sisters, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that makes your teeth ache and your instincts scream danger. "She's been living with us for months, helping with the down payment on our house. Such a generous mother-in-law." The women at the table smiled politely, their Botoxed faces frozen in expressions of sympathy, but I caught the glances they exchanged, the kind of looks that said everything without words. I knew what they were thinking because I'd thought it about other women their age. Poor old woman probably can't manage that big house on her own anymore. Probably needs constant supervision. Probably grateful for any attention her son's new wife is willing to give her. What Victoria didn't mention to her perfectly manicured audience was how that help had actually happened. The carefully orchestrated campaign that had led to me packing up my Bel Air penthouse and moving into their Beverly Hills mansion like some elderly refugee seeking shelter from the storms of aging. 3 months ago, Victoria had convinced Jackson that my penthouse wasn't safe for an elderly woman living alone. Despite the fact that the building had 24-hour concierge security and I had a housekeeper who checked on me daily. "What if you fall in that big shower, Eleanor?" she'd said, tears glistening in her perfectly lined eyes during what I now realize was a carefully choreographed performance. What if something happens and no one knows for hours? Jackson would never forgive himself if something happened to his mother because we didn't step in when we could have helped. Before I knew what was happening, they'd hired movers to pack up my life and relocate me to their guest wing, temporarily of course, while we looked for something more suitable to my changing needs as a woman of advancing years. Meanwhile, the $1,900 I'd given them for their house down payment had mysteriously transformed from a loan with clear repayment terms into what Victoria now called a family contribution, money that would be paid back when things settled down financially. But things never settle down when someone discovers they have access to your bank account and your trust. She's practically family already, Victoria continued, and the way she said practically made my chest tighten with the sudden realization that after 5 years of dating Jackson and 9 months of elaborate wedding planning, I was still auditioning for acceptance in my own son's life. The word hung in the air like a sword, sharp and gleaming with the promise of exclusion, a reminder that despite everything I'd given and sacrificed, I remained an outsider looking in on the life I'd helped create. But the real humiliation, the moment that changed everything between us forever, came during the speeches when the carefully constructed facade of family unity cracked wide open like an egg hitting concrete. Jackson stood up, champagne flute in his manicured hand, beaming at his new bride with the same expression he'd worn at 5 years old opening Christmas presents. Pure joy unmarked by any shadow of the storm that was coming. "I want to thank everyone who made this day possible," he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom filled with 200 guests who represented the best of Beverly Hills society. My beautiful wife, our families, and of course my mother, who's always been there when we needed her most. The applause was polite, appropriate, exactly what you'd expect at a wedding where everyone understood their role in the carefully choreographed performance of family happiness. Then Victoria rose from her chair, elegant and poised in her wedding dress that had cost more than most people's cars, and the room went quiet with the kind of anticipation that precedes either poetry or disaster. She'd insisted on giving her own speech, claiming she had something special to say about family and love and the bonds that unite us across generations. I should have seen it coming, should have recognized the setup, but I was still believing in the fairy tale that we were building something beautiful together. "I also want to say something about Eleanor," Victoria began, her smile so bright it could have powered every chandelier in the room. "She's been living with us for months now, and I've learned so much about family loyalty from watching her navigate this new chapter of her life." My heart swelled with something dangerously close to hope, thinking maybe I'd misjudged her. Maybe the daughter-in-law I'd been so careful around was finally showing me the warmth I'd been longing for. "She's taught me that real mothers never stop taking care of their children, no matter how old those children get or how capable they become of managing their own lives." The applause grew uncertain now, a scattered sound that suggested the audience wasn't quite sure whether they should be moved or concerned by this unexpected direction. Victoria wasn't finished with her masterpiece of public humiliation disguised as tribute. Some mothers, when their sons get married, they step back gracefully and allow the wife to take over the nurturing role, but not Eleanor. She's shown me that a mother's job is never really finished, that the bonds of dependence should never be severed completely. The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with the kind of uncomfortable tension that makes people study their champagne flutes instead of meeting anyone's eyes. I felt every eye in that ballroom focus on me like spotlights. 200 pairs of scrutinizing gazes that suddenly saw me not as Jackson's accomplished mother, but as the clingy, dependent woman Victoria had so skillfully painted with her words. I understood with crystal clarity what had just happened. Victoria had publicly branded me as pathological, someone who couldn't release her grip on her adult son, someone whose presence in their lives was tolerated rather than celebrated. The applause that eventually came was scattered and awkward, the sound of people who weren't sure if they'd just witnessed a touching tribute or a passive-aggressive assassination. But Victoria still wasn't finished with her carefully crafted destruction of my reputation and dignity. "Eleanor's even helping us financially, because that's what mothers like her do. They sacrifice everything. Their independence, their own needs, their own comfort, all for their children's happiness. She paused for effect, letting the implications sink in like poison into fresh wounds. It's really quite inspiring to see someone so completely selfless. Someone who finds purpose in making sure her adult son never has to face the challenges of true independence. The words hit me like physical blows, each phrase carefully chosen to paint me as both saint and pathetic dependent, generous and emotionally manipulative, loving and ultimately unhealthy in my attachment to my son's life. The silence that followed felt like eternity, a frozen moment where I realized that everything I'd believed about my relationship with Jackson and Victoria had been an elaborate fiction. I was not the cherished mother-in-law being welcomed into an expanding family. I was the problem to be managed, the obstacle to be overcome, the elderly inconvenience to be systematically dismantled through public shame and private manipulation. Victoria had just announced to Beverly Hills society that I was a woman who couldn't let go, who'd never learned appropriate boundaries, who was still financially supporting my grown son because I was too emotionally immature to step aside and let him build his own life. The humiliation burned through me like acid, but underneath it, something else was forming. A cold, hard fury that would sustain me through everything that came next. But that wasn't the worst part of Victoria's carefully orchestrated campaign, to destroy my dignity and independence. The worst part came the next morning when I woke up in what had once been my temporary accommodation and was now clearly my permanent prison, to find Victoria and a man in an expensive suit sitting at the kitchen table that had once been mine but was now permanently theirs. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed different somehow, harsher and more clinical, like the lighting in a hospital room where bad news is delivered with professional compassion. "Eleanor," Victoria said brightly, as if the previous night's public humiliation had never happened, as if we were still playing the game where she pretended to care about my welfare. "This is Mr. Wellington from Pinnacle Legal Group. We need to discuss some paperwork regarding your living situation and financial arrangements." I poured myself coffee from the machine I'd bought them as a housewarming gift, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system like electricity. After 42 years of motherhood and 30 years of running my own business, I'd learned to recognize predatory behavior in all its forms, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that I was about to be devoured. The kitchen that had once felt welcoming now felt like a trap, beautifully decorated but fundamentally hostile. A place where my destruction would be carried out with legal precision and fake concern for my well-being. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral while my mind raced through possibilities, none of them good for my immediate future or long-term independence. "Well," Victoria said, exchanging a meaningful glance with the notary that spoke volumes about their prior coordination. "Jackson and I have been talking extensively about your situation, and we think it's time to make some important changes. For your own protection and peace of mind." She leaned forward with the kind of concerned expression that emergency room doctors perfect for delivering terminal diagnoses, all professional sympathy wrapped around a core of absolute determination. "You've been so generous with the house down payment, and we want to make sure you're properly taken care of as you navigate the challenges that come with advancing age and changing capabilities." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth as I realized I was hearing the opening arguments in a case where I was simultaneously the defendant and the disputed property. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that whatever Victoria meant, it wasn't going to involve my opinion or preferences in any meaningful way. Mr. Wellington cleared his throat with the practiced discretion of a man who'd spent years facilitating the transfer of assets from vulnerable people to their more aggressive relatives. "Mrs. Blackwood, your son and daughter-in-law have made arrangements for you to transition to Golden Oaks Luxury Estate, one of the finest assisted living communities in Southern California. They've already submitted the application and put down a substantial deposit to secure your placement." My coffee mug connected with the marble countertop harder than I'd intended, the sharp sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot in the carefully orchestrated silence that followed. "Without consulting me?" I asked, though the question was rhetorical. Of course they hadn't consulted me, because consultation implies choice, and choice was clearly not part of their plan for my future. "We wanted it to be a surprise, Eleanor," Victoria said, her voice gentle, but her eyes hard as flint, cold and calculating in a way that made my skin crawl with the sudden recognition of just how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. "Jackson's been so worried about you living independently, even here in our home where we can keep an eye on you. And frankly, Eleanor, you've seemed a bit forgetful lately, a bit overwhelmed by the complexity of managing your affairs." Forgetful. The word hit me like a physical slap, designed to undermine my confidence and plant seeds of doubt about my own mental acuity. I was 68 years old, not 98, and my mind was sharper than most people half my age. I could still calculate complex design budgets in my head, remember every client's preferences without notes, and navigate the labyrinthine politics of Beverly Hills society with diplomatic precision. But Victoria had been building this narrative for weeks, hadn't she? Like a skilled prosecutor assembling evidence for a case I didn't even know was being prepared against me? Little comments about me misplacing things that I'd never actually misplaced, gentle corrections when I remembered events differently than she claimed they'd happened. Subtle suggestions that I was becoming confused about details that I remembered with perfect clarity. "I haven't been forgetful," I said carefully, each word measured and precise. "Or are you hoping I won't remember that the house we're sitting in has my name on the deed alongside Jackson's?" Victoria's smile never wavered, but something shifted. Behind her eyes, a flicker of surprise that she hadn't expected me to retain such clear awareness of my legal and financial position in their carefully constructed power dynamic. "Actually, Eleanor, that's part of what we need to discuss today. Jackson and I have decided to refinance the property to take advantage of better interest rates, and it would be much simpler, much cleaner from a legal standpoint if the property was solely in our names. You understand how complicated joint ownership can become, especially when one party is transitioning to assisted living and won't be residing on the property anymore." The casual way she dismissed my ownership stake, as if it were an inconvenient technicality rather than a significant financial asset, told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to proceed. "And my $9,500 down payment?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on the comfortable way Mr. Wellington was settling into his chair, clearly expecting this to be a routine transaction rather than a negotiation between equals. "Consider it a wedding gift, Eleanor," Victoria said, with the kind of sweetness that makes diabetics check their blood sugar. "A contribution to Jackson's happiness and our family's future stability. After all, you want your son to be happy and secure, don't you? What mother wouldn't want to give her child the best possible start in married life?" The audacity was breathtaking. They were asking me to surrender my assets and my independence while framing it as an act of maternal love, as if refusing to be robbed would make me a selfish, unnatural mother. The notary was getting visibly uncomfortable, checking his expensive watch and probably wondering how much longer this family drama would take to resolve so he could move on to his next appointment. He had no idea he was witnessing highway robbery in broad daylight, conducted with legal documents and emotional manipulation instead of guns and masks. "Where's Jackson?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal everything I needed to know about my son's role in this carefully orchestrated betrayal. "Shouldn't he be here for this conversation about my future and his inheritance?" Victoria replied without missing a beat, her response so smooth it was clearly rehearsed. "He's at his personal trainer session. He found all this financial and legal talk stressful, so he thought it would be better if I handled the details and presented him with the completed arrangements." Of course, Jackson had avoided confrontation. It was a pattern that had defined our relationship since he was 12 years old and too afraid to tell me directly that he'd wrecked his bicycle, sending his girlfriend to deliver the bad news instead. When he'd crashed his Bentley Continental GT at 17, He'd had his roommate call me from the hospital rather than face my disappointment and concern in person. And now, at 42 years old, he was still sending intermediaries to do his emotional dirty work, still unable to look me in the eye when difficult conversations needed to happen. The realization that my son was willing to participate in my financial and emotional destruction, but too cowardly to face me while it happened, was almost more devastating than Victoria's calculated cruelty. "Mrs. Blackwood," the notary said gently, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he began to understand that this wasn't the routine elder care arrangement he'd been hired to facilitate. "I do need to inform you that according to these documents, you'd be signing away all claim to the property in exchange for having your assisted living costs covered for the first year. 1 year. They were buying me out of my own investment, stripping away my financial security and independence in exchange for 12 months of institutional care at a facility I'd never seen, never chosen, never wanted." "And after that year?" I asked, though the question felt academic, since I had no intention of signing anything that would place my future in Victoria's manicured hands. Victoria shrugged with the kind of elegant indifference that only comes from a lifetime of having other people solve your problems for you. "Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Eleanor. Maybe by then you'll have adjusted to community living so well that you won't want to leave. Maybe you'll have made friends, found activities you enjoy, discovered that independence isn't as important as safety and social connection." The audacity was breathtaking in its scope and precision. They'd planned this entire scenario with the attention to detail of a military campaign. The wedding with its public humiliation disguised as tribute, the touching speech about family loyalty that painted me as pathologically dependent, the systematic undermining of my confidence and autonomy, and now the final act of stripping away my assets and independence in one fell swoop. But here's the thing about underestimating someone who's survived everything life can throw at them. It only works if they don't see it coming, and I was beginning to see everything with perfect clarity. The pattern of manipulation, the careful construction of a narrative that painted me as incompetent and burdensome, the systematic isolation from my own financial resources, the emotional blackmail disguised as concern for my welfare, it was all becoming crystal clear like fog lifting from a harbor at dawn. "I need some time to think about this," I said, standing up from the table with the dignity I'd maintained through decades of business negotiations with people who'd initially underestimated my intelligence and determination. "This is a major life decision, and I don't make major decisions under pressure or without proper consideration." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly and calculating underneath the practiced sweetness. "Eleanor, Mr. Wellington has other appointments today, and his time is quite valuable. It would be much more convenient for everyone involved if we could just handle this paperwork now and avoid the necessity of multiple meetings." The word convenient struck me like lightning. Convenient for whom, exactly? Certainly not for the woman being asked to sign away her life's work and independence. "I'm sure it would be convenient," I replied, my voice carrying 40 years of authority earned through building a successful business from nothing. "But I'm not signing anything today. These documents represent major changes to my legal status and financial position, and I'll need time to review them with my own legal counsel." Mr. Wellington looked relieved, probably realizing for the first time that he'd been brought in to facilitate what might not be an entirely voluntary transaction. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, that's absolutely your right. These are significant decisions that shouldn't be rushed." After they left, I sat alone in the living room I'd helped furnish, surrounded by artwork I'd helped select, looking at walls I'd helped paint in the house I'd helped purchase, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was living in enemy territory. Victoria had made one crucial mistake in her master plan to destroy my independence and steal my assets. She'd forgotten that I'd been Jackson's mother for 42 years, which meant I'd been dealing with manipulation, evasion, and emotional blackmail since before she was born. That afternoon, while Victoria was out getting her post-wedding manicure touched up and probably celebrating her anticipated victory with champagne and caviar, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went through my own paperwork with the methodical precision of someone whose life might depend on what she found. The documents I'd kept in the fireproof safe that Victoria had insisted we store somewhere secure in their master bedroom walk-in closet, supposedly for my own protection, but really to ensure I couldn't access my own legal papers without asking permission first. It's funny how somewhere safe really meant somewhere Eleanor can't get to without supervision. Another small but significant step in the systematic erosion of my autonomy and independence. I found exactly what I was looking for, and more importantly, what Victoria didn't know I still had access to. The original deed to the Beverly Hills mansion showing both Jackson's name and mine as equal co-owners, not the junior partnership Victoria had been implying. The canceled check for $19,500, clearly marked as down payment loan with specific terms for repayment, not the family gift Victoria kept insisting it had always been intended to be. And most importantly, the power of attorney documents that Jackson had asked me to sign 6 months ago. Documents that Victoria had presented as a simple precaution in case something happened to my health or mental capacity. Just in case something happens to you, Eleanor, she'd said with tears in her eyes that I now recognized as completely artificial. This way, Jackson can help manage your affairs without having to go through the courts. It's really quite common for people your age. What Victoria didn't know, because she'd been too confident in her own cleverness to read the fine print, was that I'd had my lawyer add a very specific clause that made the power of attorney conditional on my mental competency as determined by 2 independent physicians chosen by me, not by Jackson or Victoria. In other words, if I was still sharp enough to manage my own affairs, which I absolutely was, the power of attorney was completely void and unenforceable. Despite what Victoria wanted everyone to believe about my declining mental faculties, I was still playing chess while she was playing checkers, still thinking 3 moves ahead while she was focused on her immediate victory. My phone buzzed with a text from Jackson that revealed everything I needed to know about his level of courage and integrity. Sorry I missed the meeting this morning, Mom. How did things go with the paperwork? Hope everything worked out smoothly. I stared at that message for a long time, my heart breaking a little more with each word. My son, the boy I'd raised to be honest and strong, was asking about the signing away of my rights and assets via text message, as if I was a business transaction he could delegate to his wife and then check on later like a stock price or weather report. The casual cruelty of it, the complete absence of any recognition that he was asking about fundamentally altering his mother's life, was almost more devastating than Victoria's calculated manipulation. I typed back carefully, each word chosen, with precision. We'll need to discuss this in person when you get home, Jackson. This isn't something to handle through text messages. The response came immediately, revealing the depth of his cowardice and complicity. Actually, I'm staying at Tom's place tonight. Wedding recovery, you know how it is. Victoria can catch me up on everything tomorrow. Wedding recovery. He'd been married less than 48 hours, and he was already avoiding coming home to face the consequences of what he and his wife were trying to do to me. Or maybe he was avoiding the guilt that came with looking your mother in the eye after participating in her systematic destruction. That evening, Victoria ordered sushi from Nobu, and we ate in relative silence at the dining room table that had cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by the quiet luxury that I'd helped create, but was no longer welcome to enjoy as an equal participant. She seemed confident that pressure and time would eventually wear down my resistance, that the combination of isolation, financial dependence, and emotional manipulation would eventually break my spirit and force me to accept whatever terms she decided to offer. Eleanor, she said, as we cleared the plates with movements as choreographed as a ballet, I hope you know that everything we're proposing is because we love you and want what's best for your future. Jackson worries constantly about your safety, your security, your ability to navigate the challenges that come with aging in a world that wasn't designed for elderly people. I'm sure he does, I replied, though I was beginning to doubt whether Jackson had any genuine thoughts about my welfare that hadn't been planted there by his manipulative wife. Golden Oaks really is extraordinary, Eleanor. They have art therapy, wine tastings, even a library with first edition classics that you'd absolutely love. You'd make new friends, people your own age who understand what you're going through, who share your interests and experiences. People my own age, as if I'd somehow become incompatible with the rest of humanity by virtue of having lived through the Reagan administration and remembered what life was like before the internet transformed human interaction into something cold and transactional. Have you actually visited this facility? I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal more about their motivations than their concern for my happiness. Of course, Jackson and I toured it extensively last month. The staff is wonderful, trained specifically in geriatric care, and the accommodations are quite spacious, much more appropriate for someone with your evolving needs than trying to maintain independence in a world that's becoming increasingly complicated and dangerous for elderly people. There it was again, your needs. As if being 68 automatically created a list of special requirements that only Victoria possessed the wisdom and authority to identify and address. What exactly are my needs, Victoria? I asked, genuinely, curious to hear her catalog of my supposed limitations and deficiencies. She looked surprised by the directness of the question, as if she'd expected me to simply accept her assessment of my capabilities without challenge or discussion. Well, senior needs, medical supervision for the health issues that inevitably arise, social interaction with age-appropriate peers, structured activities that provide purpose and engagement, the kind of comprehensive support system that becomes necessary as we age and our abilities naturally decline. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I was actually considering her expert analysis of my requirements. And you've determined that I need these things because, Eleanor, you're almost 70 years old, she said, adding months and years to my actual age the way she'd been doing for weeks now, fast-forwarding me toward incompetence with mathematical precision. Living independently becomes exponentially more challenging at your stage of life. We're just being proactive, taking steps to ensure your safety and well-being before a crisis forces us to make decisions in emergency circumstances. Almost 70. I was 68 and 3 months, but Victoria had been systematically aging me in her conversations with Jackson and everyone else, creating urgency around decisions that didn't actually need to be made for years, if ever. I see, I said calmly, though inside I was marveling at the sophistication of her manipulation. And when exactly did you and Jackson decide that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions about my living situation, my finances, and my future? Victoria's patience was starting to fray around the edges like expensive fabric that's been stretched too tight. We're not saying you're incapable, Eleanor. We're saying it's time to be realistic about your limitations and accept. Help before pride leads to a preventable tragedy. Limitations that coincidentally included the limitation of owning property they wanted to control, money they wanted to access, and independence they wanted to eliminate. That night, I lay awake in the guest bedroom that had once been my temporary solution and was now apparently my last night of freedom before being shipped off to institutional care, like an inconvenient piece of furniture. Victoria had made it clear that the Golden Oaks arrangement would happen with or without my cooperation. They'd use the power of attorney, claim I was becoming forgetful and unsafe, present a united front of concerned family members who just wanted what was best for their elderly relative. But Victoria had made her second crucial mistake. She'd assumed that a woman who'd raised a son alone while building a successful business, who'd survived the death of a husband and constructed a new life from grief and determination, would be easy to manipulate and ultimately powerless to resist. The next morning, I got up early and made my famous blueberry pancakes using the recipe I'd perfected over decades of Sunday morning breakfasts when Jackson was young and our relationship was uncomplicated by the toxic dynamics that Victoria had introduced into our family. The same recipe I'd been making since he was 5 years old, back when he'd sit at our tiny kitchen table in our modest apartment and tell me about his dreams of having a big house someday, never imagining that achieving that dream would require sacrificing his mother's dignity and independence. These pancakes represented everything that was genuine and loving about our relationship, everything that Victoria was trying to destroy with her calculated campaign of emotional manipulation. "These smell wonderful," Victoria said, appearing in the kitchen in silk pajamas that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, perfectly coordinated even first thing in the morning because image management was a full-time job for someone whose entire identity was built on surface perfection. "What's the occasion?" she asked, as if the act of cooking breakfast in my own kitchen required justification or explanation. "No occasion," I replied, sitting down across from her with my own plate. "Just felt like doing something normal and nurturing before my world gets turned upside down." She cut her pancakes into precise, symmetrical bites, approaching even breakfast, with the kind of calculated control that characterized everything she did. "I hope you've had time to think productively about our conversation yesterday, Eleanor," she said between delicate forkfuls. "Mr. Wellington called this morning, and he can return this afternoon if you're ready to move forward with the arrangements." The phrase "move forward" was perfect in its ambiguity. Forward toward what, exactly? Toward my destruction disguised as my salvation? Toward the systematic theft of everything I'd worked for, presented as concerned family planning? "I've definitely been thinking," I said, and that was absolutely true, though not in the way Victoria hoped or expected. Then I asked the question that would begin Victoria's downfall. "Can I ask you something specific, Victoria? What exactly made you decide that I needed assisted living?" She looked puzzled by the directness of the question. "Well, as I've explained, your age, your safety, the natural vulnerability that comes with advancing years." But I pressed on with the precision of a lawyer examining a hostile witness. "No, I mean specifically. What incident or behavior made you think I wasn't safe living independently? Was there a fall I don't remember? A moment of confusion that concerned you? A specific health scare that I've forgotten about?" Victoria paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, clearly realizing that she was being asked to provide concrete evidence for her abstract claims. "It's not about one dramatic incident, Eleanor. It's about the overall pattern, the gradual decline in capabilities that happens naturally as we age." But I wasn't going to let her escape into generalities. But there must have been something specific that triggered this concern about my safety and mental capacity. Some moment when you thought, "Eleanor clearly can't live alone anymore." Can you give me one example? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. And in that silence, Victoria finally revealed the truth she'd been hiding behind all her concern and manipulation. She couldn't point to a single instance where I'd demonstrated incompetence because there hadn't been any. Her entire campaign was built on manufactured evidence and emotional manipulation designed to make everyone else believe I was declining while I was actually functioning perfectly well. I pulled out the small notebook where I'd been documenting something very specific over the past 3 months, evidence I'd been collecting without her knowledge. "Let's talk about timing, Victoria," I said, opening to the first page. "March 15th. You mentioned to Jackson that I'd left the stove on after making breakfast, except I'd made toast in the toaster that morning, not used the stove at all." Victoria's face went expressionless, but I could see calculation in her eyes, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much I could prove. "March 22nd. You told Jackson I'd forgotten our dinner plans and made other arrangements, except we never had dinner plans because you'd canceled on me that morning." I flipped the page with the satisfaction of a prosecutor presenting damning evidence. "April 3rd. You suggested I was having trouble following conversations because I'd asked you to repeat something. What I'd actually asked was for you to speak louder because you were whispering." "Dorothy, I don't know what you think you're proving with this paranoid documentation," Victoria said. but her voice had lost its honeyed sweetness and now carried the sharp edge of someone whose carefully constructed lies were being systematically dismantled. April 18th. You mentioned to Mrs. Chen next door that I'd gotten confused about what day it was. I'd asked if it was Tuesday or Wednesday because I'd lost track during my recovery from the flu, which you failed to mention to her. I could see Victoria calculating rapidly, trying to assess how much damage this evidence could do to her carefully constructed narrative of my mental decline. You've been building a case against my mental competency for months, I continued, with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades documenting business negotiations and building legal cases against corporate opponents who thought they could outmaneuver an experienced woman. Every minor mistake, every normal moment of human uncertainty, every instance of being tired or sick, you've been cataloging and presenting as evidence of cognitive decline to anyone who would listen. The notebook contained months of meticulous record-keeping that proved Victoria's systematic campaign to undermine my credibility and independence, evidence collected while she thought I was too confused to notice her deception. You're being paranoid, Eleanor, she said. But the accusation lacked conviction because we both knew I was simply being observant and thorough in ways she'd never expected from someone she considered a declining old woman. Her confidence was cracking like expensive veneer under pressure, revealing the cheap manipulation underneath all her practiced sophistication and concern. Am I paranoid? I asked calmly, pulling out another section of my documentation with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd been building an airtight case for months. Then why did you tell the wedding planner that I was getting confused about details when I simply disagreed with your choice of $15,000 imported orchids? And why did you tell Jackson that I was becoming fixated on money matters when I asked reasonable questions about how my $19,500 was being spent on? A wedding that cost more than most people's annual salaries? Victoria was quiet now, her jaw clenched with the tension of someone whose web of lies was unraveling in real time like a badly constructed sweater. She'd been so confident in her ability to manipulate and gaslight that she'd never considered the possibility that I was documenting her deception and preparing my own case for the battle she'd declared against my independence and dignity. The woman who thought she was dealing with a confused elderly woman was discovering that she'd been playing chess with someone who'd been thinking 5 moves ahead while she was still focused on her opening gambit. It's not your money anymore. Eleanor, she exploded with sudden fury, dropping all pretense of caring concern and revealing the greedy, desperate person she'd always been underneath the designer clothes and practiced charm. You gave it to us freely as a contribution to our future. You can't give someone a financial gift and then spend the rest of your life micromanaging how they use it or demanding accountability like some kind of controlling loan shark. But I was ready for this argument too, pulling out the folder I'd retrieved from their bedroom safe during one of my supposedly confused wandering episodes, the same safe Victoria thought was securely locked away from my allegedly failing memory and judgment. A contribution? I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the bitter satisfaction of someone whose trap was finally springing closed. When exactly did my loan become a gift, Victoria? Because I have the original paperwork right here, and it very clearly documents this as money to be repaid within 2 years, with specific interest terms and collateral agreements. I spread the documents across the kitchen table like a winning poker hand that I'd been holding close to my chest for months, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal my cards. Loan agreement with specific repayment terms that Jackson had signed, deed showing joint ownership that Victoria had been trying to eliminate, power of attorney documents with mental competency clauses that she'd never bothered to read carefully, and my personal favorite piece of evidence, the email thread between Victoria and Jackson from 2 months earlier that revealed their true intentions with crystal clarity. "What email?" she asked, her face going pale as she realized I'd accessed communications she thought were private and secure, protected by her assumption that I was too technically incompetent to navigate modern technology. "The one where you wrote," and I quote, We need to move faster on the Eleanor situation before she starts asking more questions about the money. I'm worried she's going to cause problems with the refinancing if she figures out what we're really planning. We need to get her signed into Golden Oaks and her assets transferred before she understands what's happening to her. The silence that followed was complete and damning, filled with the weight of exposed truth and shattered pretenses that had been carefully constructed over months of systematic deception. Victoria sat there looking at the evidence of her own calculated cruelty spread across the table like autopsy photos of her destroyed credibility and revealed character. "You went through my private messages," she whispered, but the accusation was hollow and desperate because we both knew what those messages revealed about her true intentions and moral character. "I accessed communications about my own life and financial future," I corrected, with the calm authority of someone who just played their ace in a game they'd been planning to win from the beginning. "The same way you've been going through my medical records, my personal belongings, and my private conversations to build your fabricated case for having me declared incompetent." Her face cycled through expressions of shock, rage, and calculation as she tried to figure out how much damage control was still possible at this point in her exposure. "You don't understand the financial pressure we're under, Eleanor," Victoria said, finally dropping all pretense of family concern and showing me the desperate, greedy person she'd always been underneath the carefully constructed facade of loving daughter-in-law. "The mortgage payments on this house are crushing us. The wedding expenses depleted our savings. The baby coming means we need financial security, and the lifestyle we need to maintain in Beverly Hills requires resources we don't currently have access to. We needed options, we needed solutions, we needed someone who could help us build the life we deserve." And there it was, the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath all the manipulation and fake concern like a cancer growing in the darkness. "You needed my money and my property," I said quietly, my voice steady, despite the pain of seeing my son's marriage revealed as nothing more than an elaborate financial scheme. "But you never needed me as a person or family member." "You're almost 70 years old, Eleanor," she said, with the kind of casual cruelty that takes your breath away and makes you question everything you thought you knew about human decency. "You don't need long-term financial security the way we do because you don't have decades of expenses ahead of you. You don't need property investments because you won't be around long enough to see them appreciate significantly. Children to raise, careers to build, a social position to maintain. These are concerns for people who have actual futures to finance, not for elderly people whose primary job should be staying out of the way." In Victoria's twisted worldview, my remaining years were worth less than their future plans, my needs negotiable because I didn't have as much time left to need things, my assets better used by younger people who could appreciate them longer. The calculation was breathtaking in its heartless precision. Elderly people should surrender their life's work to younger people because youth somehow creates a greater moral claim to resources than the decades of work and sacrifice that created those resources in the first place. But Victoria had just made her final and most crucial mistake by revealing exactly who she was underneath all the manipulation and false concern, and now I knew exactly how to destroy her completely and permanently. "You're right about one thing," I said quietly, standing up from the table with the dignity I'd maintained through decades of challenges, betrayals, and business battles that had taught me how to recognize predators in expensive clothing. I'm getting older, and I probably don't have as many years left as you do, which is exactly why I'm not going to spend whatever time I do have being manipulated, controlled, and financially exploited by someone who sees me as nothing more than a disposable resource." The hope that flickered across Victoria's face died quickly as I continued with steel in my voice that she'd never heard before. "I'm not signing your papers, Victoria. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And if you try to force this issue, you're going to discover that underestimating a 68-year-old woman was the biggest mistake of your pathetic, predatory life. And if you and Jackson want me out of this house," I continued with the kind of cold fury that comes from months of suppressed rage finally finding its target, You're going to have to follow proper legal procedures and prove in a court of law that I'm actually mentally incompetent, not just inconvenient for your financial plans and lifestyle ambitions." That's when Victoria made her final desperate play, pulling out the nuclear option she'd been saving for exactly this moment when her careful manipulation failed and she needed to destroy me emotionally to maintain control. "You selfish, bitter, old woman," she hissed, all pretense of family affection evaporating like morning mist in the California sun. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to Jackson, to our marriage, to our future? You're destroying his happiness because you can't accept that your role in his life has fundamentally changed and you're no longer the most important woman in his world." But I'd been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, the moment when her mask would slip completely and show me the monster she'd been hiding beneath all that practiced sweetness and fake concern for my welfare. "You're forcing him to choose between his pregnant wife and his controlling mother," she continued, building toward her climactic manipulation with the skill of someone who'd clearly done this before to other vulnerable people. "What kind of unnatural mother destroys her own son's happiness by refusing to step aside gracefully and let him build his own independent life, free from your emotional manipulation and financial control?" The accusations were designed to cut deep into every insecurity I'd ever felt about motherhood. And they did, because like all effective lies, they contained threads of truth twisted into ugly shapes that made me question everything I'd ever done as a parent and as a woman trying to maintain connection with her adult child. But even if everything she said contained elements of truth about my own imperfections and mistakes as a mother, it didn't justify the systematic fraud and emotional abuse they were perpetrating against me now. "Even if some of what you're saying contains grains of truth about my parenting," I said, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest from hearing my maternal love characterized as pathological control, "it doesn't give you the right to commit felony fraud against me or steal my life savings under false pretenses of family concern." Victoria laughed then, a sound like expensive crystal shattering on marble floors, cold and sharp enough to cut skin. "Fraud? Theft? You gave us that money freely as a family contribution, Eleanor. You moved in here by your own choice, seeking our help and protection. Nobody forced you to do anything. We simply helped you make the right decisions for everyone involved in this family situation. After you spent months systematically undermining my confidence and independence," I replied, my voice gaining strength as I spoke truths I'd been holding inside for too long. "After you convinced Jackson and everyone else in our social circle that I was becoming mentally incompetent and physically unsafe through a carefully orchestrated campaign of lies and manufactured evidence. After you isolated me from my own support systems, made me financially dependent on your supposed goodwill, and gaslit me into questioning my own memory and judgment." I pulled out my phone with steady hands and showed her the screen that displayed months of careful documentation and strategic planning. "I've been recording everything, Victoria. Every conversation, every manipulation, every lie you've told about my mental capacity, every instance of financial coercion disguised as family concern. And this morning, while you thought I was taking my usual confused elderly woman nap, I made some very interesting phone calls to people who are going to be extremely interested in your little scheme." The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized that her supposed victim had been preparing for this confrontation with the same methodical precision and strategic thinking she'd used to plan my systematic destruction and financial exploitation. "What phone calls?" she whispered, her voice barely audible as she began to understand that the power dynamic in our relationship had shifted dramatically and permanently. "Dr. Sarah Chen, my physician for the past 12 years, has provided a comprehensive cognitive evaluation and written report confirming that I show no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other condition that would impair my decision-making capacity or justify guardianship proceedings," I said, pulling out the official medical report, with letterhead that would stand up in any court proceeding. Detective Maria Rodriguez from the Beverly Hills Police Department's Elder Abuse Division has been very interested in hearing about systematic financial exploitation disguised as family care, especially when it involves forged documents and psychological manipulation of vulnerable senior citizens. And most interesting of all, I continued, savoring this moment of complete reversal like the finest wine I'd ever tasted, your mother, Catherine, had some absolutely fascinating stories to share about your previous relationships and your well-documented history with elderly victims who trusted you with their hearts and their bank accounts. Victoria went completely white, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a death mask as she understood that her past was catching up with her in ways she'd never anticipated or prepared for. "You called my mother?" she whispered, her voice cracking with the realization that her family relationships were about to be destroyed along with her criminal schemes. "I called a woman whose daughter was committing serious crimes against me," I corrected with the moral authority of someone whose conscience was completely clear. "I called someone who needed to know immediately that her child was continuing patterns of predatory behavior that apparently stretch back years and involve multiple innocent victims." "What did she tell you?" Victoria asked, though her defeated posture and trembling hands suggested she already knew the answer and understood that her carefully hidden criminal history was about to become public knowledge. "She told me enough to understand that I'm not your first victim, Victoria," I replied, watching her face crumble as decades of hidden crimes began surfacing like bodies floating to the surface of a lake. "She told me about the elderly men you dated and systematically financially exploited before you met Jackson, about your first marriage that ended when your husband discovered you'd been stealing money from his disabled father's checking account, about your employment at Golden Oaks and why you were really terminated from that position for suspected theft from residents' accounts." The irony was absolutely perfect. Victoria had chosen the exact same assisted living facility where she'd previously committed crimes against elderly residents as the place to warehouse me after stealing my assets and independence. That afternoon, while Victoria was supposedly out shopping for baby clothes but actually meeting with a lawyer she couldn't afford, I received a visit that changed everything in ways I hadn't expected. Catherine Sterling stood at my door holding an envelope and wearing the kind of expression that mothers get when they finally acknowledge that their child has become someone they can no longer recognize or defend. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Catherine Sterling, Victoria's mother, and I owe you the most profound apology any human being has ever owed another." I invited her in, curious about what revelations were about to unfold in my living room. "When you called me yesterday and told me what Victoria was doing to you, my first instinct was to defend my daughter because no mother wants to believe their child is capable of such calculated cruelty and systematic criminal behavior," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from me with the weight of terrible knowledge. "But I've known Victoria for 34 years, and if I'm completely honest, I've seen this exact pattern of behavior before, and I've been enabling it by making excuses and covering up the consequences. When Victoria was in college, there was an incident involving her elderly roommate's credit cards that Victoria claimed was just a misunderstanding," Catherine continued, her voice heavy with shame and regret that had been building for years. "She said she'd borrowed money temporarily and fully intended to pay it back before anyone noticed, but the bank records told a very different story about systematic theft and deliberate deception. We hired expensive lawyers, paid for restitution, and made the whole problem disappear because we wanted to believe our daughter had simply made a terrible mistake that would never happen again." I listened with growing understanding as Catherine painted a picture of a young woman who'd been perfecting her techniques of elder abuse for over a decade. There were other incidents after college. Elderly men she dated briefly who experienced mysterious financial problems during their relationships with her. An incident at the assisted living facility where she worked that resulted in her termination for suspected theft from residents' accounts, though charges were never filed due to insufficient evidence. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope that she placed on my coffee table with trembling hands. "This contains $19,500 in cash, Mrs. Blackwood. the exact amount Victoria stole from you through fraudulent loan agreements and emotional manipulation. I stared at the envelope, understanding that this money represented much more than financial restitution. I can't take your money, Catherine. You're not responsible for your adult daughter's criminal behavior and poor moral choices. But Catherine shook her head with the determination of someone who'd finally decided to stop enabling destructive behavior. Yes, I am responsible, at least partially, because I've been making excuses for Victoria's predatory behavior for years. Instead of forcing her to face real consequences for her actions, she said, my husband built his business on the principle that integrity isn't negotiable, and I failed to teach that lesson to Victoria. But I won't compound that failure by letting her victim suffer financially for my parenting mistakes. The next morning brought the confrontation I'd been preparing for since the moment I'd realized what Victoria was really doing to me. She returned from her lawyer meeting with the kind of desperate confidence that comes from having no good options left but refusing to surrender without inflicting maximum damage. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Eleanor, she said, settling into the kitchen chair across from me with predatory grace that no longer fooled me for a second. And I realize you're right about some things, but you're also making a terrible mistake that's going to destroy Jackson's happiness and our family's future. I poured coffee for both of us, maintaining the civilized pretenses even as we prepared for total war. What mistake would that be, Victoria? I asked, genuinely curious about what final manipulation she thought might save her from the legal consequences that were rapidly approaching. You're going to destroy Jackson's marriage and his relationship with his unborn child because you can't accept that your role in his life has fundamentally changed, she said, playing her final emotional manipulation card with the desperation of someone whose world was collapsing around her. But I want to give you one last chance to reconsider your position before this situation becomes irreversibly damaging for everyone involved. That's when Victoria made her ultimate mistake. She revealed the nuclear option she'd been holding. In reserve, the threat she thought would force me to surrender completely and accept any terms she offered. The Beverly Hills Police received an anonymous tip this morning about prescription medication found in your possession that doesn't belong to you, she said with a smile that was pure malevolence disguised as concern. Apparently someone found unmarked Xanax pills in your purse and reported it as potential drug abuse by a senior citizen whose family is concerned about her deteriorating judgment and mental capacity. I smiled back at her with genuine amusement for the first time in months, finally understanding that Victoria had just played her last card and revealed the full extent of her desperation and criminal thinking. You mean Sarah Martinez's prescription that she asked me to pick up for her before she moved to Phoenix? I asked calmly, my voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd been 3 steps ahead of this conversation for weeks. The prescription I've been meaning to mail to her new address, but kept forgetting about because, as you've mentioned repeatedly, I'm getting forgetful in my old age? Victoria's confident expression wavered slightly as she realized her master manipulation might not work the way she'd planned, that once again she'd underestimated the woman she thought was too confused to outmaneuver her schemes. Can you prove that story, Eleanor? Sarah Martinez moved away weeks ago, and who's going to believe the word of a confused elderly woman against documented evidence of prescription drug abuse found by concerned family members? Actually, that's an interesting question, I replied, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app I'd been using to document our conversations for months, while she thought I was too technologically incompetent to operate modern recording devices. I hit play, and Sarah Martinez's voice filled the kitchen with crystal clarity that would stand up in any courtroom. Eleanor, it's Sarah calling you back about that prescription. I'm so sorry for the confusion, but yes, those are definitely my Xanax pills that I asked you to pick up before I moved to Phoenix. I completely forgot to get them from you before I left Beverly Hills. Could you please mail them to me at my new address? Thank you so much for remembering, and I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused. The look of absolute defeat On Victoria's face was worth every moment of planning and preparation I'd invested in anticipating her desperate final moves. "But here's what's really interesting about your anonymous tip to the police, Victoria," I continued, savoring each word like vintage wine as her world continued to collapse around her with mathematical precision. Detective Rodriguez was fascinated to learn that the person who reported suspected prescription drug abuse was the same person who'd been systematically building a false case for elder incompetency for months. The same person who stood to gain financially from having me declared mentally unfit and legally vulnerable. Victoria's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, calculation, rage, and finally something that looked almost like respect for an opponent she'd catastrophically underestimated. "You've been recording our private conversations without my knowledge or consent," she said, grasping for any legal technicality that might save her from the consequences of her own actions. "California is a one-party consent state for recording conversations, Victoria, which means I have every legal right to document discussions about my own life, finances, and welfare," I replied with the satisfaction of someone whose legal research had been thorough and meticulous. "Unlike your systematic fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, my evidence collection has been completely legal and professionally documented by qualified investigators." I pulled out another folder that I'd been saving. For exactly this moment, the nuclear option that would eliminate any possibility of Victoria escaping justice or manipulating her way out of accountability. Detective Rodriguez has also been very interested in the financial forensics report that traces exactly how you've been systematically draining money from elderly victims for over a decade, including detailed bank records showing your pattern of targeting vulnerable seniors across multiple states. The blood drained from Victoria's face as she realized that her entire criminal history was about to become evidence in a federal case that would destroy not only her freedom, but any possibility of escaping justice through legal technicalities or expensive lawyers. "You don't understand what you've done, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice cracking with the realization that her carefully constructed life was about to implode in spectacular fashion. "Jackson will never forgive you for destroying his marriage and sending his pregnant wife to prison. You'll lose your son forever because of your vindictive need for revenge against someone who was only trying to help you navigate the challenges of aging with dignity and security." It was her final attempt at emotional manipulation, one last desperate effort to make me feel guilty for refusing to be her victim and holding her accountable for her crimes. "Jackson will have to make his own decisions about forgiveness and family. Loyalty," I replied calmly, though the thought of losing my son forever was like a knife through my heart that I refused to let her see. "But I'd rather have an honest relationship with a son who knows the truth than a dishonest relationship built on lies, manipulation, and criminal fraud that would eventually destroy all of us anyway." The truth was that Victoria had already poisoned my relationship with Jackson through months of systematic manipulation and gaslighting, and the only way to save any possibility of genuine connection with him was to expose the lies that had been destroying our family from the inside. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their self-destructive choices, even when those choices involve people they think they love. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the knock came on our front door with the kind of authoritative sound that every criminal eventually learns to fear. The knock of law enforcement officers who'd finished building their case and were ready to make arrests. Detective Rodriguez stood there with two uniformed officers, Catherine Sterling, and a warrant that represented months of careful investigation and evidence gathering that would finally bring Victoria to justice. "Mrs. Victoria Sterling-Blackwood, you are under arrest for elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and violation of fiduciary duty to a vulnerable adult," Detective Rodriguez announced with professional precision. "You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The look of absolute shock and disbelief on Victoria's face was worth every moment of pain, humiliation, and fear she'd put me through over the past months. "This is Eleanor's fault, isn't it?" were Victoria's first words, even as the handcuffs were being applied to her wrists, demonstrating that even facing arrest for serious felonies, she was still unable to take responsibility for her own criminal choices and moral failures. She's a vindictive old woman who can't accept that her son has moved on with his life, so she's using false accusations and manufactured evidence to destroy my family because she can't control us anymore. Even in custody, Victoria was still trying to manipulate the narrative and paint herself as the victim of an elderly woman's jealousy and confusion, rather than as a predatory criminal who'd built her entire adult life around exploiting vulnerable seniors for their life savings and independence. Jackson arrived home exactly 23 minutes later, his Bentley Continental GT screeching to a halt in our driveway as he saw police cars surrounding the house he'd worked so hard to afford through legitimate means, never knowing that his wife had been planning to steal the down payment that had made it all possible. The expression on his face as he walked through the front door and saw Victoria in handcuffs while I calmly explained the situation to Detective Rodriguez was a complex mixture of shock, betrayal, confusion, and something that might have been relief that the truth was finally coming to light after months of uncomfortable tension and unexplained hostility between the two women he loved most. "Mom, what's happening here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he tried to process the scene unfolding in his living room. "Your wife has been arrested for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to steal my life savings while having me declared mentally incompetent and imprisoned in an assisted living facility," I said gently, watching his face crumble as he began to understand the full scope of what had been happening in his own home while he'd been avoiding confrontation and letting Victoria handle all the difficult conversations. "Jackson, I need you to know that I never wanted this outcome, but Victoria left me no choice except to fight back or lose everything I'd worked my entire life to build." The pain in his eyes as he looked back and forth between his handcuffed, pregnant wife and his vindicated mother was almost more than I could bear. But I knew that painful truth was better than comfortable lies that would eventually destroy us all. 3 months later, as Victoria's criminal trial dominated Beverly Hills society pages and Jackson struggled with the aftermath of learning that his entire marriage had been built on financial manipulation and elder abuse, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew me. Instead of pursuing maximum criminal penalties and civil restitution that could have sent Victoria to prison for decades, I agreed to a plea bargain that would result in 18 months of incarceration, 5 years of probation, full financial restitution, and mandatory counseling for personality disorders and criminal thinking patterns. "Why are you showing her mercy after everything she did to you?" Catherine Sterling asked me during one of our weekly coffee meetings that had developed into an unlikely friendship built on shared experience with Victoria's destructive behavior. "Because Jackson's daughter deserves to have some relationship with her mother, even if that mother is a convicted felon who spent the first year of her child's life in prison," I replied, holding baby Emma in my arms while Jackson attended a therapy session designed to help him process the trauma of discovering that his wife was a career criminal who'd married him primarily for access to what she thought was his wealthy mother's inheritance. And because sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about stopping future victims and giving people a chance to change, even when you don't believe they will. The investigation into Victoria's criminal history had revealed 6 other elderly victims across 3 states. And my testimony had been crucial in securing restitution for families who'd been financially devastated by her sophisticated schemes. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, Jackson and baby Emma moved into a modest apartment 3 blocks from my new penthouse on Wilshire Boulevard, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to maintain healthy boundaries as he rebuilt his life and processed the betrayal that had shattered his ability to trust his own judgment about people and relationships. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said during one of our weekly Sunday dinners, holding Emma while she played with the silver spoon that had been his when he was her age. "I'm sorry for not protecting you, for not listening to your concerns, for letting Victoria isolate you and manipulate both of us. I'm sorry for being too much of a coward to face difficult conversations that might have prevented all of this pain and trauma." "We both made mistakes, sweetheart," I replied, though the truth was that his mistakes had been born of conflict, avoidance, and misplaced loyalty, while mine had been born of trusting someone who'd proven herself completely untrustworthy through her actions rather than her words. The important thing is that we learned from them and that we're building something honest and real now, something based on truth instead of manipulation and financial exploitation disguised as family love. Emma gurgled happily in her father's arms, blissfully unaware that she was the innocent victim of her mother's crimes and her grandmother's need for justice, but surrounded by family members who were committed to protecting her from the toxic patterns that had nearly destroyed all of us. 1 year later, I received a letter from Victoria in prison, 5 pages of handwritten manipulation that alternated between fake remorse, attempts to rewrite history, and subtle threats about what would happen when she was released and could pursue custody of Emma through family court systems that she believed she could manipulate just as successfully as she'd manipulated everyone else in her life. I read the letter once, felt nothing but pity for someone whose fundamental inability to accept responsibility for her actions would probably ensure that she continued making the same destructive choices for the rest of her life. And then I did. Something that felt incredibly liberating. I threw it away without responding and went about my day as if Victoria Sterling-Blackwood had never existed. Sometimes the most powerful response to manipulation is complete indifference to the manipulator's attempts to regain control over your emotions and decisions. Thanks for watching this story about how a 68-year-old woman refused to be anyone's victim and ended up saving other elderly people from financial predators who see our age as weakness rather than wisdom earned through decades of surviving everything life can throw at us. Remember that your age doesn't determine your power. Your courage, preparation, and willingness to fight for what's right determine your power. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories. And share your own experiences in the comments below, because your voice matters and your story might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it's too late to protect themselves and their families from predators who prey on trust, love, and family loyalty.